Well, thank you, Maureen. It's so nice of you to have said what you said, although what a waste of paper to have printed some. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Alberto Espay. As you heard, I happen to be a doctor that loves to doctor. I am at the University of Cincinnati. Next year, it'll be 20 years since I've been here. So this is the place I call home. It's, of all the cities in the world I have lived, this is the one that I've lived in the longest. So I'm a Cincinnatian by adoption. I wanted to tell you today something that's very dear to our hearts, which is the concept that to make progress, we must abandon the idea that we're dealing with a disease. It isn't. In every other field of medicine that has accomplished progress has at some point broken up with the idea that whatever disease they are dealing with was a disease. And so it's okay to call it Parkinson's disease, but it's not okay to really think of it as a disease. It is many, and perhaps as many as people living with it. When you go into the place of a, let's say an oncologist, right? Not that you may have heard that people coming to see a cancer doctor might be given a diagnosis, breast cancer, for instance. And the oncologist hastens to add, we don't know what that means. There is a diagnosis made, there is a disease state made, but yet the thought is, let's be clear, we don't know what it means to you. We need to do a variety of different things to be able to understand what disease you have so that we know how to treat your disease. And that treatment will be very different to other people with breast cancer. We say, based on my experience, you check all the boxes for this thing called Parkinson's disease. Trust me, I'm an expert. Wow. That's how we do it, though. Quaint for the 19th century, perhaps for a lot of the 20th, but it should really not be for the 21st. And part of the reason I like to speak to groups of patients is because you have the greatest power to change this. We neurologists, especially those of us working in research, think we have it all right, that if we just keep on working in the manner that we have, we'll eventually get to the cure. The cure. So I've used this title, cures, and I emphasize it's plural because there can't be a cure for Parkinson's because it is a disease that really isn't, right? So in the future, we hope to get to a point where we said, you have something called Parkinson's disease? I have no idea what it means to you, and I'm sure that Jim's Parkinson's disease will be cured, but that cure for Jim's will not be Mary's Parkinson's cure. That's kind of the idea. And so these are my disclosures, and none of them are quite as relevant as the fact that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is in this book, Brain Fables. Of course, things have changed. This book was published in 2020. I was glad to see it get an award for the best neuroscience book published in that year. And so it surprised me because I don't write books for that reason, but I like to know that part of the reason we really are here is because we must change. And a lot of what we've based our research on are great ideas, but fables. And when you have great ideas that aren't true, nature doesn't give a damn. So let's start with what I consider our original sin. All of you have been familiar with crime scenes, shows into which investigators come to a crime scene, and you see corpses there, and of course, the investigators try to figure out how that came about. They piece together the sort of clues that are embedded into a crime scene, and the idea is that a theory is generated about how the crime was committed, and of course, at some point, you start thinking about who the perpetrator or perpetrators may have been. The violation of our forensic approach to the field is that we came to that crime scene of a brain autopsy. Back in the day, a century ago, all we had to do is wait for somebody to die, examine the brain, and look at the corpses. Those corpses, particularly this one that you see right there, is what we've referred to as Lewy bodies. And you probably have heard that Lewy bodies are the, quote, diagnostic hallmark of Parkinson's. If you have Lewy bodies, you have Parkinson's. Now, when we say that there is a diagnosis of Parkinson's, or when you hear this, you will, in the same sentence here, well, we know you have Parkinson's because if we examine you, we do a biopsy somewhere, usually in the brain, but actually anywhere, we'll find Lewy bodies in an aggregated fashion, and that's called, or synuclein. That's the protein that forms the Lewy bodies. That synuclein clumps up into Lewy bodies. That's how we do it. This is the main problem by saying we found the perpetrators of the crime. We did not pause to say, oh, we just found a victim and victims, because it is not just the Lewy bodies, there is a variety of other proteins that are clumped up and form what is referred to as pathology. Pathology is simply what those that are looking under a microscope find, and often is used as exchangeable with another fancy word, pathogenesis, meaning that pathology, the clumped up proteins, have caused the disease, are pathogenetic. Pathogenesis means that the pathology generated or created the disease. So this is our original sin. Now, when you have this idea, if the problem is the pathology, the Lewy bodies, then what is the solution? Clean it up. That's the solution. And we've actually been quite good at this. People don't know how successful treatments have been in the pipeline that either prevent the formation of this or clear this up. So if we were just to look at success from the perspective of what we achieve in trials, we've cured Parkinson's. But we haven't. We all know that. Because, as I'll tell you later, we haven't taken enough from an answer, or enough for an answer from those studies. So when you see this Lewy body in the brain or anywhere else, and if you collect everybody with Lewy bodies, you begin to see that there is a diversity of ways to get there. This figure of a puzzle was reported in an article now 10 years ago. At the time, it was using machine learning, a form of artificial intelligence, before it became as sexy a word as it is now. And essentially kind of put together all of the studies that have been done at the time and organized them in such a way that it says, here's how they are all connected. And the message was, these are each of the different pathways to get to Parkinson's. How do we know they are pathways to get to Parkinson's? Because in each of these cases, in each of these different biological changes, there is a Lewy body formation. Lewy bodies are present, right? Now think of a disease in general that happens to involve so many different aspects of the way cells function. So if I am a drug developer and I say, gosh, I have a drug that works by changing the calcium channels, what disease could I use it for? I go into the map of Parkinson's disease and I say, oh, Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a disorder of calcium dysregulation. This is where we need to do it. And you not be wrong by looking at this and say, well, yes, it's actually there. And that is, as you'll see in a moment, the approach we've had to curing Parkinson's, to slowing Parkinson's progression. It hasn't worked, not because we haven't invested into these efforts, it's because we have this idea that just about anything can lead to Parkinson's. And if we think of a therapy that seems exciting in an animal model and is linked to something we know about Parkinson's, then it'll work. This idea of Parkinson's as a one puzzle is problematic, as you can imagine, right? Because it creates the image that if we have all of the pieces together, eventually we'll get there. Now, you could then wonder, though, when is it that we will have this one last piece that when it falls into the puzzle, we'll finally see the whole thing at once? And it's also telling us that somehow all these things are really quite fitting together, which, of course, upon very close inspection, you know they aren't. We want to see them together, but they aren't. There was a very famous neurologist who in 2017, 200 years after the first description of what became known as Parkinson's by Dr. James Parkinson in 1817, was asked, how close are we to the cure? And this person said, you know when you build puzzles, you know how when you start from the corners and you work your way in? We have all the corners covered. I don't know what that meant, but it sounded pretty good. Warm and fuzzy, hopeful. And one message that I have for you today is we all want hope, but hope on false basis serves no one. So instead of seeing the puzzle in this fashion, I think that it's important for us to recognize that perhaps it isn't as if there is a puzzle, but very much a collection of different puzzles. Why? Because each of us is a puzzle. So when you think of them, it's not just how much we can put together, but how much of these pieces we can separate, such that then as we do so, we begin to recognize the different ways into which we get into Parkinson's, because it is the only way forward to match the therapies that we have to the types of abnormality that drive our Parkinson's. And that's what I meant when I said Mary's Parkinson's will be cured with a treatment that will be irrelevant to Jim's Parkinson's, to George's. So, when you ask again the question, when will the cure of Parkinson's will come, be mindful that the question is, when will the cure for my Parkinson's come? Right? And as I've alluded to and I've emphasized, the reason we think still that there will be a cure is because we deal with what we refer to as convergent biomarkers, which essentially means if you have Lewy bodies, and if you have this thing called dopamine deficiency, this is a DAS scan, you have Parkinson's. It doesn't almost matter how it came to be. We now recognize you as having this one thing called Parkinson's, right? And that's a form of reductionism, meaning we want to make sense of the difficulty, the complexity of the world by a construct that we can understand, that we can put our hands around. And that's something that will not be sufficient, So this is where we typically put our attention in. This is the image of the Lewy bodies under the microscope. That's called Lewy pathology, as I've mentioned to you. But what's important is that we are dealing with this as if it were the beginning of the problem. And it is the absolute end of the problem. The beginning of the problem, we don't even know, but the beginning of the problem in everyone is different. But what happens to converge is that proteins that are normal, especially this one called alpha-synuclein, react against something that shouldn't be there. And what that might be could be biological, it could be toxic, it could be infectious. But the proteins are there to defend us. And this protein called synuclein is everywhere in the body. Everywhere. Must be kind of important for a protein to be literally everywhere in the body. And as it reacts against something, it forms these Lewy bodies. That's what we get in response to a problem. But it's important to say that as the pathology forms, that which forms the pathology becomes depleted. It's exhausted, right? The more you have been fighting against something, whatever that is, the less of the supplies to fight, which is a normal protein, you have. And it's interesting, when I'm with a room of experts, I'm talking to my colleagues, at some point I have to start saying, proteins can only function when they are normal, which sounds silly to have to say, but it is a gigantic blind spot in research, right? Because what we're dealing is cleaning the debris. Imagine a forest that's been ravaged by a storm, by logging, by fire, and you come into it and you see all these tree stumps, the pathology. And you say, you know what, if I clean these tree stumps, this forest will come back to health. Silly. No, it won't. There's nothing you can do by cleaning the debris that will somehow make the forest appear again. Forest appears again by reforestation. And that's a concept we've not done. We haven't. Because remember, back to our original scene, when we look at the crime scene, we saw the corpses, the Lewy pathology. What was absent? What the Lewy pathology looked like. And that's because those proteins are no longer there. They're gone. They became these corpses, these Lewy bodies. And whatever was out of sight was also out of mind. We haven't been thinking much about the fact. And it turns out that it's the case that if you see this brain, as the brain gets so-and-so clumped up with Lewy bodies, for instance, what's around the brain, you might miss it, is becoming less concentrated with the proteins that form that pathology. And I'm showing here an example that to emphasize that the physics of how proteins transform from soluble to insoluble, solid to liquid, is very similar to the crystallization process. In proteins case, we call it polymerization, but it's the same physics. It's second law of thermodynamics and Gibbs free energy. These are the two physical principles, and the ingredients are temperature, concentration, and catalyst. That's pretty much it. So what we end up with is the loss of the normal proteins. And in fact, in every study, I'm showing you just one of them, that looks at individuals with Parkinson's, there is a reduction in the levels of the normal proteins. Alpha-synuclein is the first, but A-beta-42. A-beta-42 is an important protein because when you see it clumped up into amyloid plaques is what defines biologically Alzheimer's. We have in Parkinson's a reduction in A-beta-42 very similarly as it happens in Alzheimer's. And by the way, that's another reason why this idea of saying this is Parkinson's and this is Alzheimer's, that makes sense to us simply because back in the day when we were able to check on only one protein, we saw the Lewy bodies mostly in people who had the Parkinson symptoms, and we saw the amyloid plaques in people who had the cognitive symptoms. But it turns out that if we looked at any autopsy study, people who have pathology-proven Parkinson's, meaning we said it was Parkinson's, an autopsy was done, Lewy bodies were found, confirmed. Lewy body is confirmed there, confirmed the diagnosis of Parkinson's because that's the hallmark of Parkinson's. And then we ask the question, how many of these brains in any series will also have the confirmation of Alzheimer's on pathology, the definition of Alzheimer's, the amyloid plaques, which means the low levels of A-beta-42. 80%. 80%. That's not to say, well, by the way, imagine that would then have to mean if we are to adhere to our concept that this is Parkinson's and this is Alzheimer's and these are different diseases, that we would have to say, well, Parkinson's is an unlucky disease because 8 out of 10 individuals will have Alzheimer's. Probably not the case, but that's the kind of anomalies that we end up achieving by virtue of the way we think. So there is a lot of protein. After all, in diseases where there is some degree of degeneration, the problem is not what we gain, the pathology, but what we lose. Yet we've been targeting what we gain. We did a simple study, the PPMIs. You probably are familiar with this. This is a study that the Michael J. Fox Foundation sponsored. We've been part of the PPMI for about 12, 13 years now. And what we did is we removed all the clinical data. We say, let's just do away with the subjective data, the scales that we use and so forth, and just looked at 2 variables that are objective. One, in the y-axis, is brain volume. The higher you go, the higher your brain volume. That's the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, 2 proteins. On the left, alpha-synuclein. Remember, that's the protein that transforms into Lewy bodies. And on the right, A-beta-42. Remember, that's the protein that transforms into plaques and makes Alzheimer's. But this is just cohorts of people with Parkinson's. So we remove everything else and just ask the question, what is the relationship between these 2 variables? Do the levels of these proteins predict the extent to which you will have a normal brain volume? And the higher the levels of the protein, even though the study wasn't designed for this, the higher the levels of the proteins, the higher the brain volume, the normal brain people have. The lower the levels of the protein, the less brain people have. It kind of makes sense. It's simple, but it's a proof of principle that proteins are there for a reason. The field of Parkinson's, as it is the case for the field of all neurodegenerative disorders, is referred to as a synucleinopathy. Have you guys heard that word, synucleinopathy? You've heard that word, very good. Proteinopathy is the global concept. It's the idea that the proteins are diseased. Synuclein is the protein, pathy, disease. Disease of the protein. It's not true. This protein is not disease. Proteins can only function when they are normal and just cease to function when they are clumped up into pathology. That's a certainty. We've embraced the uncertainty, which is that once they turn into Lewy bodies, they become toxins. They are diseased. And that concept is too good to pass because we all love a story in which there is a villain against which to galvanize. But that's the story we've told ourselves. That's why it's the most important of all the brain fables. This one is an interesting one. And there's plenty of literature, but I just chose one piece of evidence to show you the folly of where we are and to explain where we're heading with this. Here on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the number of Lewy bodies, LBs, Lewy bodies in the nigra. The substantia nigra is the part of the midbrain that produces dopamine. So you want to be further to the right. You want to have more of those neurons, right? And on the vertical axis is the number of nigral neurons. You want to be up there. You want to have lots of those, right? By the way, number of Lewy bodies, sorry, I should say number, you want to have less or fewer of the Lewy bodies if the Lewy bodies are bad. That's what I should say. And the number of neurons, you want to have more, right? So essentially, you want to sort of have this relationship, meaning that, or according to our way of thinking, if the proteins are bad, the more of the Lewy bodies in the nigra, the fewer neurons you have. That's why that's an inverse relationship, right? And this is one of many, many studies that shows this stuff. That is actually quite the opposite. One could, in fact, say from all the data that if we were not to look at it from our biases, but from data is speaking for itself, that in fact, the more of the Lewy bodies there are, the more neurons. What? Yes?
Possibly the more neurons there are, the more places there are for the Lewy bodies to be, and therefore.
That's a good point. So the question, or the comment was made, well, is it possible that the reason you have more Lewy bodies is because, and more neurons is because the neurons is where the Lewy bodies are. If that were actually the case, which is absolutely a great point, then you would expect that the regions in which there have been more Lewy bodies, they will have more degeneration, and that's never been demonstrated. So the Lewy bodies, in reality, are a reaction of a normal brain to something that shouldn't be there. As I mentioned, toxic, biological, or infectious, and everybody's different. So what element would vary in different people. There was a nice study that demonstrated that if you have a PET scan to measure amyloid plaques, we don't have a PET scan to measure yet Lewy bodies, but we can measure amyloid plaques. The idea is very similar to what Parkinson's is, right? A beta 42 transforms into plaques, or alpha-synuclein transforms into Lewy bodies. We cannot measure Lewy bodies in people alive. We have to wait till they're dead for the brain to be examined. But we can measure today amyloid plaques with a PET scan. People that are demonstrated not to have any abnormalities in PET, so no plaques in their brain, amyloid plaques, are asked to sleep deprive themselves one night, sleep as little as possible for one night. The next day, a PET scan is done. And that PET scan shows that plaques are there now. So the conclusion of that research, which was done and reported about 3 years ago, is that sleep deprivation is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. Think about it. It kind of makes sense in our worldview because we see that people with Alzheimer's have lots of problems with sleep. But most of us have problems with sleep. Another explanation with the exact same body of data is that sleep deprivation represents a sort of an injury that the brain reacts against by making amyloid. Same data, vastly different interpretation. So in this model that I show you, where the normal proteins are lost because they are reacting against something and the pathology is formed, when we look at the therapeutic pipeline, 70% of everything we're doing is trying to get rid of the synuclein in its aggregated form or prevent the formation of it. But absolutely nothing yet is in this part. It's in trying to replenish the normal proteins that we're losing, that we know the levels are low. And that must change. Because if you can imagine, say, well, gosh, we need more investment into Parkinson's. We need more money into Parkinson's, right? More research. Yeah, you can do more research and spend a lot more money into it. And I think money is a good thing in general, but you can double the budget to do what's down here in the bottom, and we will get nowhere. People think that the reason we don't have a cure is because we haven't invested enough. We don't have enough money. The budget hasn't been enough. And by the way, we have been very grateful with the generosity of the community in supporting research. But we also recognize that if you put that money into bad ideas, it won't help. You can double the budget. If we keep on doing what we've been doing, we're not going to get ahead. It's not a problem of money alone won't overcome the fundamental problems that we have in terms of our research. Now, I'm going to show you this to make that point, which is we are investing tremendously in Parkinson's. So these are two coins, so to speak, and I'm using that metaphor for a reason. On the left, you have the year 2022. On the right, you have the last year, 2023, for all of the studies that have been done or that are in the pipeline. There are 3 circles, concentric circles. You can see in the center is phase 3, phase 2, phase 1, right? Phase 1 are the earliest types of studies, usually looking at therapies for their safety. And as you get to phase 3, you're looking at them for their efficacy. And at the lower half of this, you see those are ST or symptomatic therapies. These are things that are meant or designed to help with the symptoms. At the upper half of both of those coins is DMT or disease-modifying therapy. The therapy is designed not to help the symptoms, but to slow the progression or reverse the progression, right? We are treating symptomatic therapies as if they were equal to, in the development, as disease modification. In other words, things that actually somehow can work to help the symptoms, the method that we use to bring these therapies to the fore will be the same method that we would use if we were to test therapies to slow progression. The problem with that is that whatever helps us collectively for our symptoms is never going to help for the disease, because we've established that everyone is different. We've said that for a long time. So what works in a lumping form for symptomatic development cannot work for disease modification because it requires splitting. Lumping is okay for symptom development. Splitting is necessary for disease modification. But disease modification has a long story of failures. These are the selection of the most important of them all. This is a graveyard. And if you look at each of these therapies, these have been great therapies. These are great molecules. It just happens that we've used each of them to everyone with Parkinson's. We've essentially established them to be amazing in an animal model, cures Parkinson's in mice, for instance. And then the next step is to say, all right, well, now we are going to do it for Parkinson's patients. We're going to give it to people with Parkinson's. And of course, the mistranslation occurs at that point. The idea of thinking that whatever happened in the mice model would somehow translate into humans with Parkinson's. It never worked. So what we've missed with this is for whom those therapies should be. Because we have lots of whats, lots of good stuff, but the what-who connection must be made. The who requires proof of the mechanism that's at work in you so that then you could benefit from that particular intervention. And one point that I'm going to make further is that when you're invited to a study that is meant to slow progression of Parkinson, sounds good, right? Your question must be, why me? Why are you inviting me? And if the answer is, well, because you have Parkinson's. In fact, because you have early Parkinson's. It could be, usually we like to enroll people with early Parkinson's. That's the wrong answer. That's the wrong answer. I want you to say, no, why me? Because what is it about the mechanism of the therapy that you're testing that makes me a candidate for it? Right? Because if I don't have proof that my form of Parkinson's is going to be relevant to the mechanism of action of the therapy that you have, then why would I be part of it? Imagine if you were to ask that question to whoever is inviting you to a study. We would have to stop doing trials in the way we are doing them. That's the power I'm talking about that you have. Imagine if you say, we're not going to participate in trials that pretend that Parkinson's is a disease and that pretend that one mechanism somehow will work for everyone to slow or cure Parkinson's. Imagine. We'll have to really work to get into a point where we know we have to sooner. Now, the way we've been doing research, and this is an introduction of what we're doing in Cincinnati, is that if somebody like me says, you have Parkinson's, trust me, I'm an expert, then I'm going to follow that up by saying, by the way, I'd like to invite you to come to a study so that then we can understand Parkinson's. You're going to come into this bucket that is called Parkinson's disease, because we say so. And then anybody else that doesn't have what we recognize as Parkinson's, or for that matter, any neurological symptoms, we're going to call them controls and come into another bucket. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure everything we can, both in blood, in spinal fluid, et cetera, so that then we can apply statistical methods to determine the extent to which each of these measures might correlate with a bucket but not with the other, and then reach a conclusion that this is a biomarker of Parkinson's. That's kind of what we've done. And we have quite a few biomarkers of Parkinson's. But by now you know that none of those have helped much, have they? And in the discussion, if you're interested, we can talk a little bit about this new test that most of you must have heard called the seed amplification assay. It's the newest. Is what the Michael J. Fox Foundation is referring to as the game changer. And I can explain later, if you wish, why it can't be. But you probably have an idea of why that might be. What we're doing in Cincinnati, the CCBP, the Cincinnati Cohort Biomarker Program, is turning the tables. Rather than saying, The truth is that which we explain to you, Parkinson's. That's the truth, because I'm the arbiter of biology. We are saying, well, yeah, you have Parkinson's, but we don't know what that means. So if you come into this cohort, what we'll do is we're going to be looking at the biological signals, especially those in a range that tells us that you might be a candidate for something that already exists that you could benefit from. So we're looking for deploying the principles of precision medicine that perhaps many of the therapies that have already been developed would actually work if we knew who they were for. And that's what this CCPP is about, is to match people to therapies available. It's a fishing expedition, but it's an important one. I used to term fishing expedition also as a way to remind you that this is the reason why this study could have never been funded by the government. The government wants us to know, the NIH wants us to know exactly what is it that we're looking for. We should know exactly where we're going. It's hypothesis-driven research. You cannot be fishing. That's not science. And we're fishing. We're really looking for the needles in a haystack for people who today have a treatment that will stop or reverse their disease. And we don't know who they are. We don't know how to predict who is going to be a candidate for what. So that's essentially what we're doing. It's a very ambitious project. It's a once-a-year commitment for any of you who would like to come if you aren't part of the program already. We're close to 900 individuals now recruited. Of course, a lot of our efforts going to the follow-ups. But this is what other fields of medicine have done. To us, is research. To oncologists, is normal business. It's a platform for molecular subtyping. It's to getting to know our people at a biological level. The way we get to know each other in a clinic is very superficial, right? We looked at clinical features, and we make the best of it. But we need to get to know you biologically if we're going to make progress in terms of precision medicine. So everything that we say in the clinic that's clinical, we assume that to be subordinate to what's biological. In the jargon of research, we say the independent variable is, well, the independent variable is the thing that is a truth. Our diagnosis has been the truth. We are demoting that to dependent variable. The independent variable is the biology. I told you that this is entirely meant to look for individuals who are out there that we would not recognize otherwise, but that they are in a specific range of biological abnormality that renders them candidates for a therapy that already exists. Because in the future, we will have N-of-1 trials. N-of-1 trials is a very specific methodology that allows us to test in one individual the value. It's kind of like a clinical trial in one individual, N-of-1, to determine if a drug would actually be helpful. What we've proposed to the NIH, and this is now published, is that whenever any company is interested in the space of slowing progression or reversing Parkinson's, what's otherwise known as disease modification, Tier 1 should be, do you have an assay that demonstrates how your therapy works and that allows it to select the people most likely to benefit? Because tiers 2 and 3, as you see there and scan through it, are essentially features of trials, but no improvement in trial performance, execution, design will ever compensate for the fundamental mismatch between a therapy and the people that the therapy is given to. Because when I show you those graveyards, you know now that probably some of those had a role if we knew who they were for, Tier 1. So I hope to have brought to the fore the idea that we won't have a cure But we will have cures, many. The first element to the roadmap is to eliminate the idea that proteins are toxic. Synuclein, the protein that forms the Lewy bodies, was preserved on Earth before we ever came. It's in every member of the animal kingdom. It's all over our bodies, as I told you. Even red blood cells have synuclein. Evolutionary forces made it redundant. We have alpha-synuclein, beta-synuclein, gamma-synuclein. Do we think that evolution kept this protein within us so that it would be our built-in toxin? We don't have to borrow a toxin from the outside world so that we can self-select out of nature? No, right? So we must abandon this synucleinopathy, proteinopathy concept, that the proteins is the problem, that if we get rid of the proteins, we'll be free. It's already plenty of evidence to know that isn't the case. And if Lewy bodies are a sign that our brain is reacting against something, we just need to look at what that is, and if there is any loss measurably of the proteins that form synuclein, so the loss of synuclein, then we need to replenish the levels of the protein. That is what we'll be thinking of as rescue medicine. Here is the exception to the rule about splitting and lumping. We can lump here because in this situation, one common denominator is that people with Parkinson's have low levels of synuclein. Why? We don't know. That's precision medicine's domain. But we can always increase those levels. Rescue, and that could be quite important. Now, rather than continuing to insist that we need to look at what is the best test for Parkinson's, what's the best biomarker for Parkinson's, since we've established that no two people are alike, and now we're going to act as if we mean it, then we need to move past convergent biomarkers to divergent biomarkers. What is it that makes each of you different from other people with Parkinson's, rather than what is it that makes you similar to other people with Parkinson's? Because we cannot continue living the cognitive dissonance that no two people are alike. You each are blazing your own trail. But be hopeful, we'll have cure for Parkinson's. Because if you are savvy enough, you know that I'm trying to have it both ways. And nature doesn't give a damn if our ideas are false. And lastly, we must adopt the principles of precision medicine that we know have worked for other fields of medicine. Cystic fibrosis is a degenerative disease of the lungs. It's caused by one gene. This is a monogenic disease. And the first disease-modifying treatment for cystic fibrosis worked in only 4% of people. You would think that if you have one gene, you have one disease. It's not true, even for a monogenic disease. It can't be true then for Parkinson's. And so we must be able to get to this point. No molecular intervention can succeed in everyone with Parkinson's disease, because Parkinson's isn't a disease, but a syndrome. So we can then think of precision medicine not necessarily as in isolation, but perhaps even in combination with rescue medicine. And that is what we are achieving in Cincinnati. We will get there. Thank you.
We have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has one, just raise your hand and I will run over, because I don't have Parkinson's.
There's a microphone coming to you. Just hold on a sec. Oh, and then there's another one. So go first, and then you can go second.
The existing studies that were broad-based and people were looking for an individual cure, the people that it did help, is there enough information available for the people that it helped to help you figure out what was different about those people?
It's a great question. We have never prepared our trials for what's referred to as post-mortem analysis. Once they fail, we go back and examine, are there people that benefited here? We've never done that, except with one study that was called the SURE-PD3. We were part of it. Essentially, it's the first and only study that selected people using a molecular marker, low urate. Urate, or uric acid, is a very important free radical scavenger. It's an anti-aging molecule we all have. But in Parkinson's, the levels tend to be low. And the lower the levels, the faster the progression, right? And also, by the way, at a population level, the lower the levels, the higher the risk of developing Parkinson's. So it made sense to increase the levels of urate. And the reason I'm telling this story is because we accomplished that. We increased the levels of urate with a drug called inosine, a precursor, and yet nothing happened. I was part of the committee to look at the subgroups because surely there must be someone who could benefit. And in this case, no one did. It's remarkable. But your point is well taken. We should keep on thinking that there are going to be therapies that will be tested, even in a restricted setting, such as the SURE-PD trial, that could work for a few, and that we need to be prepared for that. And actually, I'm always advising companies to collect specimens so that we can get to that point where we say, well, we might be able to identify who the responders are and then do a subsequent trial smaller with just those individuals. Great point. Please.
Above these proteinopathies that involve some sort of misfolding, I mean, there are proteins that fold one way and they stay that way forever, but I think none of these is one of those, that they have part of their function is to dynamically refold depending on some sort of circumstance.
Well, so the transformation of proteins from normal to abnormal, from liquid, we call it soluble, to solid or insoluble, from functional to non-functional, is irreversible. You have to get to what's referred to in physics as a nucleation barrier. If that is overcome, then the transformation proceeds apace. Yeah?
I'm saying that from one normal liquid form, there's several normal liquid forms, and it's flexible between them, which makes it vulnerable to solidifying.
Right. The question for those of you who couldn't hear is, are there different soluble forms and different insoluble forms? And I think that there are several proteins anyhow, and therefore several soluble normal forms that are synuclein is by no means the only one. But once the Lewy pathology state is achieved, there is no reversibility that we know of. Now, that concept might change, but at the moment it appears to be a one-sided direction. It's not as if you have Lewy bodies and then you can dissolve them and get the normal proteins up. That's what we somehow think at the moment. Yes?
So for those of us who are not in this study yet, I assume you need new patients.
Yep.
And is just going to that website that's on the screen the
Yes.
best way to inquire?
Exactly. That's the best way to do it. There is a way to actually submit a request to get in through that. There's also a phone number there if you prefer a phone number instead.
We also have the research team here today, and so there's a table with signups.
Oh, good. I'm glad that, yes, thank you so much, Maureen. I know that some of the team members are here, and I didn't know if they had the
They're going to
material.
be speaking about all the clinical trials.
Beautiful, beautiful.
My question is, you had a couple of scatter charts up there that you said intuitively you would expect if this was high, then, or the higher this is, the lower this should be, and so forth. But it looked like you had a probability on those scatters
Yeah.
that was like near zero. So really, I mean, they were just, if you didn't have the line on there, you wouldn't be able to look and say, oh, clearly there's this kind of relationship.
Yeah, well, so that's a good point. It is not a perfect relationship, but it's exactly opposite in direction than what was hypothesized. So the hypothesis is the hypothesis meaning the proteins are toxic. The more the toxic proteins you have, the fewer the neurons you have. And in fact, the data is trending in the opposite direction. And by the way, that is data from the early, from the 2000s, mid 2000s. So we've had enough data to at least rethink what we are doing. Not necessarily perhaps to change it entirely, but to at least rethink it. And I joke with my colleagues, fortunately as a neurologist, I can be self-deprecatory. And I tell my colleagues that we neurologists are really quite very arrogant species of doctors, because we typically come up with an idea. Step 2 is to conclude is brilliant. And step 3 is to do the research to just document how brilliant our idea was. And then what happens is that when the research doesn't quite tell us what we know is for sure there, we change the experimental paradigm, we change the molecule, we change something here, but we don't go back and say, maybe our idea should be changed. No, because we already concluded it's brilliant. And so I think that that's the problem. We are the only field of medicine. This is something that I want you to think is has to change. But we're the only field of medicine that does clinical trials to learn. And it sounds great. Oh gosh, you guys are so good. You're learning. But every other field of medicine does clinical trials to test hypotheses. We don't. We do it to learn. So it makes it sound so good. And that's why not a single clinical trial report starts with the phrase, we conducted this trial to test the hypothesis that, blah, 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 blah. So therefore, when the trials are negative, which all of them are for disease modification, what are the lessons? Well, the dose might have been too low or too high. The measurements weren't sensitive enough. The design wasn't adequate. The favorite, the patient population was too advanced. What about the idea, the hypothesis? Oh, that's perfect. No, the hypothesis is perfect. It's the imperfections of the trials that mess it all up. So the point is I think the data that we have against it is imperfect, but it's all against it. In humans, not a single shred of evidence that proteins are toxic. What we conceived as toxic have only been able to prove it in animal models. In animal models, given the pathology that they don't have, naturally, they get sick. We get that thing out, they get better. Voila. We've established that pathology is a cause of the problem. But in humans, not a single shred of evidence. We just published a paper as a pledge to scientists to use animal models only as a way to test mechanisms, but neither develop new hypotheses or confirm hypotheses. And also just to simply test the safety of drugs, not to predict the therapeutic benefits. Not a single prediction of therapeutic benefit from animal models have ever panned out. And yet, actually, if we do any of our trials that we are thinking of doing with the NIH of new molecules, the NIH says, well, what is the animal model first? As if, boy, if we had the animal models, then we can proceed because that would predict the response. It doesn't. Yes.
Hi, thank you for today, and thank you for taking my question. My wife and I would like to become a part of the CCBP program. We've tried several times contacting the Gardner Center, left messages, used the website. We get no response. Are you not taking new participants?
Oh, we are. Thank you for your interest. And I'm sorry that you've had difficulty getting through. We're definitely interested. It may well be that the message didn't get to the right group, and I'm very happy to know.
I'll make sure and get your information
yes,
today.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So we'll make sure that this gets passed on today, and then that you'll be contacted. Thank you for the interest. Yes.
Yes, do you have an opinion on the use of red light therapy to improve the symptoms of Parkinson's disease?
Well,
He has an opinion on everything.
thank you. Yeah, Maureen knows me. I'm always, when any therapy doesn't have evidence backed up by randomized control trials, I'm always skeptical. some of you have heard me say the story. Stem cell therapies were tested, and people who were in wheelchairs walked out of their wheelchairs. It was amazing. We thought that was a cure. What happened, though, is that somebody had the idea of testing in a randomized controlled trial. So people who have a sham surgery, they thought they had stem cells implanted, did exactly as well as those who actually had a stem cell therapy. So companies have a great deal of knowledge that there is immense power within people with Parkinson's to believe and to achieve what their expectations are. We, in our institution, a number of years back, actually, because people were traveling to Florida to get intravenous glutathione injections. Glutathione is an amazing molecule when you look at it. It's another anti-aging molecule. In the 80s, the studies in brains showed that people with Parkinson's had low levels of glutathione, so it made sense. That was the cause of the problem. Giving more glutathione was the way to go. It didn't work out in clinical trials, even though there was a sense of not ever doing it, because it makes sense to just keep on doing them, right? So people traveled to Florida to get this because there was a clinic there, and I think there might still be a clinic there that does this, and people were getting better. Why? Because they were expecting that. So what we did in our study years back, inspired by that phenomenon, was that we did a trial where people were essentially told that they had, and I don't know if some of you participated in that trial. That was about 8 years ago or so. Some were given a molecule, an injectable dopamine agonist, that was an original molecule and therefore somewhat expensive, tested against one that had been essentially modified in a manner, the manufacturing modified in a manner that made it less expensive. But the hypothesis was that both were equal in efficacy. But one was an expensive molecule, the other one was a generic. No one was receiving anything active. This was all saline. So it was a hard study from an ethics perspective to do, because it was a study in deception. People were deceived into thinking that they were getting something that was very unique and expensive versus something that was still unique but less expensive. Those who got the expensive placebo did very well, almost as well as levodopa, and their brain changes, we were looking at brain functional MRIs, changed just the same. Those who received the cheap placebo had a benefit, but modest. And it demonstrated that if you have an expectation of efficacy, your brain changes and your behavior changes. So if you believe, it happens. So if I tell you I have something that, if you meet me out here and no insurance covers this, because of course they know that they don't want you to get better. But if you pay me $1,500, I'll give it to you out there, and you'll get better. You will. What we're doing at the University of Cincinnati is trying to harness that placebo effect minus the deception, and we have a study going on that part. So yeah. So bottom line, I think for things that are simple and inexpensive, I suppose you can try them. And if it works, great. We just don't have evidence about that particular one. Yeah. Please, Dr. Henry Kenkel, yes. You're going to need the microphone. It's coming right to you, right there.
Oh, okay. Well, just a comment about the placebo discussion. Such an important phenomenon to study, and understanding that there's so much understanding yet to be had about the ecological functions within the brain, the different parts of the brain function as a family. And some of this also is very unique to each individual. But in placebo effect, all of that ecology opens up, at least for a while. And if we could understand it better and help to promote it, we would have a whole nother part of precision medicine, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Henry. I appreciate that comment very much because I have to tell you one thing, and maybe, I don't know if we're winding down. I'll leave you with this important concept. Back in the day, related to this idea of the placebo effect, there was a time I had just finished my training, so I know it all. I thought I knew it all, and people will come to me to say, well, so what's ahead, right? What's my prognosis? And of course, I knew. This business of prognosis has a lot to do with what people actually think, but because I was put on the spot, I would say, well, okay, well, based on what we know, here's what you would expect to do, here's all these different things, and here's how I think it'll work for you. I was always wrong, always wrong. But no time was I wrongest than when somebody put me on the spot at some point, mostly the family members that really say, well, what's ahead? And it's someone that I thought at the time wasn't going to do very well for a variety of reasons. Maybe the kinds of things that I saw were things that were at a population level related to poor outcome. So that was 2006, and I said, based on what we know, we have here in a situation where probably we're dealing between 2 and 3 years. And the way she responded, it's like, but I have so much going on. I have too many things that I need to care for. In fact, you know what? I don't have time for this. And she meant it. And she's still around. And she's the one that keeps me humble. So whenever you say, well, what's ahead of me? You know that the wildest card is inside you. The power is within you because we're all self-fulfilling prophecies. If she would have bought my argument that she didn't have much ahead, and she said, oh, well, I guess this is the end of it, she might have died, right? She bought into it. She would have absolutely fulfilled my predictions. But she wasn't interested. And so I want you to think that the placebo effect is one piece of the whole thing. You are what you believe. You are who you think you are. And what will happen to you depends a lot on what is it that you're looking forward to. And keep on looking forward to different things because that is really something so powerful that none of the medications we have can get to half of it. So, any other questions? Sounds like we've covered it all. Thank you, everyone. I'll be in the back if you have any other questions. I appreciate this.
Espay.
Thank you.